Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Gresham College. I hope everybody can hear me, and I hope particularly today that you are in listening mode because, as we'll see later on, the lecture is going to incorporate some words from people other than myself. So this is the second of my lectures on environmental themes, and I'm going to today to explore some aspects of greenness and business. And by business, I'm going to embrace the city as well, which is certainly, I'm sure, overambitious, but time requires and limits that. Any of you that came to my first lecture will know that I'm a water scientist myself, a hydrologist, and I'm perhaps naturally somewhat rooted in an approach to environmental challenges that suggests a rather logical, rather linear method of approaching these things. Typically, we scientists identify an emerging or newly recognised problem. We collect lots of data and we analyse it, and then we test potential solutions against current environmental legislation and any forthcoming issues, for example, some health-related questions, or it might be the demands for carbon reductions, for example. And then having had a look at the likely costs of one or two remedies, we then take a decision on what to do. Then we, or actually more likely somebody else, acts on that advice. So we might say simples, as the advert says. If we can, I'm mimicking here a commercial enterprise in drawing on something which might be an ecological metaphor, if we go to the one you probably will recognise, real meerkats, of course, don't wear clothes. But in any case, are environmental problems that simple anyway? For the meerkats, and I'm sure most of you have seen the adverts, it's an insurance company. I can't actually remember what insurance company, which probably suggests it's not a very effective advert, but perhaps some of you do. Every problem that they face, it kind of grows in scope, it slips out of their grasp, it pops up in unexpected places, and it embodies different views about the exercising of power, and it requires new ways of thinking. So sometimes the meerkats are driven to distraction. In my last talk, I introduced the idea of wicked problems so complex or intractable that they require more than just the application of science to solve them. And today I'm going to recap on that theme and explore some environmental examples founded in the workings of business and industry, and begin to tease out a little more about the different perspectives of a range of stakeholders, some of whom you will hear. As last time, I'm going to be drawing in part, at least, on my own work as an environmental consultant and researcher, in this case, today, working for specific industrial stakeholders. And I also hope to take us a little closer to understanding how such problems may be addressed. I also promised in my lectures that you'd have an opportunity to hear a number of people who Owen Paterson, the former Environment Minister, may well have described as the green blob. People who, in his opinion, had vested interests in the identification and amplification of environmental problems. But I'm going to leave you to draw your own conclusions on that based on what you hear from people who will be identified in the slides. And I'd ask you to think perhaps that some of the opinions are not possibly those that you might have expected from individuals working in specific organisations. Now we're going to start with Mark Enzer, who's an experienced and very senior consultant with one of the UK's most respected international engineering companies. So let's hear what he has to say.
So I'm Mark Enzer. I'm the Group Practice Manager for Water and Environment in Mott MacDonald, which is an international consultancy. And I think in looking at big environmental challenges, then the key one to me is climate change. And maybe starting right at the top in relation to climate change, I think there are really only three possible responses for humankind to climate change, which is basically mitigation, adaptation and suffering. And it does seem like when it comes to mitigation, mankind has nearly given up on it. There's still some chances. Adaptation seems to be something for the rich, and suffering therefore does seem to be left over for the poor. Principally, it would be around trying to avoid the suffering, actually. But it does mean that I think we have a lot of potential role around both mitigation and adaptation. There's a lot of work that we are doing currently around climate resilience, and so that's working with companies firstly to understand what the effects of climate change might be, but then also what we can do is work with companies on mitigation, but then also a huge amount around adaptation, because adaptation is something which is relevant across all of the sectors. So we certainly see that to be the case for power, water, transportation, buildings, all of the major infrastructure sectors. Adaptation is going to be a really key theme going into the future.
Now, Mark makes a number of good points, but as you listen to my commentators today, I'd ask you to have in mind some very key questions. What do we mean, or what do they mean indeed, by greenness in business and in industry? And what sort of challenges arise from business or industrial activities? What are the potential roles of business in addressing them? And what's the actual role of business today? Are business a force for good or evil, and who says so? And finally, perhaps not on here, but what tactics do my commentators suggest for addressing environmental challenges? These are interesting questions. I'm going to just return to Mark for a minute, and then I'm going to take some commentary from Professor Laila Mehta, who holds international roles in several universities. So we'll hear Mark again.
So I'm Mark Enzer. I'm the Group Practice Manager for Water and Environment in Macdonald, which is an international consultancy. So I think fundamentally what stops us solving our environmental problems is a lack of will. If we really cared about it, we would really do something about it. And so I think there may be a number of sources of that lack of will, but I think that's probably the origin of it. And I think maybe one of the reasons why there isn't the will to solve environmental problems is because we don't quite understand the connection between the environment and the pound. Because of the way that our economy is based, everything seems to have to come down to pounds and what something's worth in monetary units. And more often than not, issues to do with the climate can't be measured directly in pounds. And so those that count pounds therefore don't care. So it's putting it in quite a stark way, but I think that's what it really comes down to. And what it points towards as a solution is for us to have a much more enlightened view of what the real cost of things are. Because quite often at the moment, the price we pay for things doesn't reflect the cost, and the cost doesn't reflect the value.
So for Mark, he's saying that he's using the term we to represent business here. If it doesn't come down to pounds, then we don't care. Let's just listen to another commentator.
I'm Laila Mehta. I'm a professor at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, and I'm also a visiting professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Business is part of the problem because often, business is largely about profit. So, and business activities can lead to environmental and social costs. But of course, business is also part of the solution because business can fund a lot of the innovation. There can be partnerships with government, with scientists, with technology experts in coming up with a lot of these, and indeed with local communities. So I guess if business really took its role seriously, if it really sought to be environmentally neutral and funded innovation and did it in a sort of egalitarian way with local partners, then there is a big role for business. Largely, I don't think business behaves very responsibly with respect to environmental issues. Business is often really part of the problem because business, let's face it, is largely interested in profit, and there are huge environmental and social costs, and often that's something that they deal with later. Especially in recent years, with this spread of neoliberalism and after the world food crisis and the inclusion and introduction of new players, you find a huge corporate involvement around land, water, food, energy. And in part it could be to be welcome, but in part, there is a lot of stuff that's going on that is often leading to huge environmental issues, increasing water and food insecurities, land and water grabs, etc. And often that is because of increasing corporate involvement in these sectors. These are sectors that traditionally were dealt with by the donors, by states. And it's very difficult to track issues around accountability when we're talking about business.
So what you hear then is both of those two commentators having reservations about the role of business. I don't think any of them, or either of them, really would have said that business are villainous, but there are some indications that they think perhaps that all is not well with that approach. They're not casting business as rapacious exploiters of the natural environment particularly, or people seeking to get away with environmental crimes and resisting legislation. But there are some hints that that might be the case. Now, I want to tell you a story now, really drawn from my own research, and I want to look at an example of a business operating in an environmental arena. It's a story, as it says here, a story potentially about cleaning up by cleaning up. 20 years ago, there was a proposal to build a secure landfill in near Rotherham. I don't know whether, is there anybody here from Yorkshire? No? Okay, well, we're safe then. Near Sheffield, an area that in the 1980s and the 1990s had experienced very severe decline in coal mining and in metals manufacturing. And the disappearance of those industries had left a legacy of contaminated land and dereliction, as well as poverty amongst the local people. There are, of course, many ways to clear up soil contamination. You can concentrate and contain the materials, or you can dilute and disperse the materials. Those are obvious examples depending on the nature of the problem and the relative toxicity and the health implications associated with that particular contaminant. Now, let's not be in any doubt that this polluting material had been generated as a result of industrial activity, the business practices of the past, in response to demand for products that we as a society had said that we needed and for which the international market was very, very large. And local people had worked in those industries, often securing very good wages. Prior to the public inquiry that debated the potential construction of the facility, the region was a net exporter of waste, so it was sending its waste elsewhere. And the site, as you see here on the screen there, selected for the construction was not itself significantly contaminated, but it was intended that it would act as a long-term repository for about 8 million tonnes of material, such as mercury and arsenic, brought from elsewhere by a locally based but national company. If you look at the slide, I think you can see that the location is well connected with motorways, it has very little residential development, and allegedly it wasn't perforated with old mine shafts that could create uncertainty in its behaviour in relation to water movement. But it was in the green belt. It was underlain by a small, shallow aquifer, and it was the home of some protected and bird species, lapwings, for example. I think it was a site of special scientific interest, or a small area of it was. And it's clear too that agricultural land would be lost and some footpaths would need diverting. This is a case that's very similar to many other cases of a couple of decades or more ago. On the picture here you can see the site, and the grey areas are surrounding settlements, and you can see there's quite a lot of streams and some ponds and so on. On the top of the screen there you can see the site is underlain by coal measures. The grey and the two shades of grey and the green are different layers in the coal measures. And on the lower part of the screen, you can see this strange shape divided into four. Basically, it's a cone in the ground, sitting down into the ground, which was going to make a secure containment for these materials. Now, I was commissioned by the company making the application as one of a number of so-called experts to examine their proposal and to advise them on whether what they were proposing was likely to satisfy the relevant planning authorities when the case was heard at appeal by the inspector who represents the Secretary of State for the Environment. This was just at a time when environmental impact was becoming significant in the UK, driven by European legislation, and it was a very interesting time for environmental professionals. It was also an interesting time for the local inhabitants, many of whom, of course, objected strongly to this proposal and configured themselves into an action group. The local authority also objected, citing a range of environmental side effects that were rather difficult to characterise, but included the risk of releases of dust and polluted drainage waters, leachate, emerging from the site. Now, the site was quite complicated, or the scheme rather was quite complicated. It involved a hardened double liner of something called dense asphaltic concrete, which is a very tough material. Very expensive, actually, as well. It required pumping to keep the groundwater out of it and to keep the groundwater down, and treatment of the leachate, and then very careful long-term monitoring of the site into the indeterminate future, and in fact, perhaps in perpetuity. Mercury, as I'm sure many people know, is a very unpleasant carcinogenic substance. Now, much of the evidence offered by both sides in the inquiry was very technical. It related to potential groundwater movements, mining, things like the molecular diffusion of materials through this concrete, and similar issues, looking at periods of centuries or more. So very, very hypothetical. My own research had suggested that the liquid releases from the site, treated waters coming from the site, both as water from within the cone and also water that might run off over the surface of the completed landfill when it stopped being used, would actually be of much better quality than the water in the local streams, many of which were contaminated by agricultural pollution and from farming and also from overflow from septic tanks from local houses that were not connected to mains drainage. However, the residents managed to secure some financial support from Richard Branson, the chief executive of Virgin, who no doubt has huge amounts to play with, and also some support from Friends of the Earth. And that allowed the local residents to bring in their own experts, which is not a situation which was usual at public inquiries at the time, and it balanced up what might have been a rather unequal fight. Now, the inquiry then, as a result of this, it ran on for 9 weeks rather than the anticipated 10 days or so. And it essentially turned into a battle between experts who were debating general principles as opposed to the detailed local knowledge which was coming from local people. It certainly had its dramatic moments. The ecological evidence that was offered was very weak, for example, and I do recall one of the professional ecologists offering evidence on bird populations, which was publicly and rather horribly dismembered by one of the barristers. I noted this particularly because I was actually the next person to be cross-examined by this barrister, and that does not give you a good feeling as you wait to go on. So that was one of the things. Some of the evidence was controversial. There was also a suggestion that the local authority had initially turned down the request because of competing interests from another potential waste disposal site, part owned by them, and that local interests might not only have been associated with the aesthetics of the development and its technical capabilities or otherwise, but the possibility of individual financial gain and some concerns about to whom that would accrue. Different factions fell in and out with one another as the strength of views of particular issues waxed and waned, and the local authority in turn was accused of not communicating with local people. And equally, I think I have to say, the company making the application initially did little to consult local people either, or to try and allay their fears. They did actually agree to meet a local councillor quite late on in the run-up to the inquiry, and he brought with him another person he said was a friend, who in the fullness of time was revealed to be a campaigning journalist, not a local resident. And that certainly did not add to any feeling of mutual trust. Now, at the time, inspectors in public inquiries were acting increasingly in the context of a shift from environmental protection to sustainability as the dominant theme. Was the scheme sustainable? And what did that mean in the context of historic contamination? In law at the time, the precautionary principle was emerging, and the National Rivers Authority, forerunner of the current Environment Agency, did not have to demonstrate that the site would cause a problem. The onus lay with the company to show that its action would not create a risk. A risk, for example, in relation to potential emissions of water, their characteristics, and where those releases might end up. And I'm not, in this example, going to go through the details of that chemistry. But the company had to show that its actions would not create a risk, or at least a significant risk. As the inquiry wore on, the company, and indeed individuals working on their behalf, including myself, were subject to local vilification. We became villains, of course. But the company persisted as they were trying to secure not only permission for that site, but for the principle of containing hazardous waste using what was then the best available technology. Now, in the end, the scheme was refused permission, at least in this location. And why exactly that happened is a matter of debate, but it appeared that the sustainability criterion was not fully met. So what do we learn from that? Well, first of all, here we have a wicked problem. We have, it's characterised by conflicts in language and the lack of full resolution. The waste, after all, the mercury and the arsenic, still needed to be cleaned up, spread around the place, across large areas of Yorkshire and indeed the north of England generally, and was still going to be there and would have to be put somewhere. We may, this is the, I showed this slide previously, this is typically the characteristics of what we call wicked problems, problems which are very, very difficult to tackle, as characterised by a couple of American commentators. The problem may in fact have the characteristics of what more recently have been called super wicked problems, where time is running out. I mean, after all, something has to be done with mercury. It really should not be sitting around leaking. And some other characteristics as well, particularly short-termism in decision-making. So perhaps this is also a super wicked problem. Stakeholders had entirely different worldviews. Many members of the company actually had a genuine commitment to proposing innovative solutions to serious problems of soil contamination. Naturally, the company needed to turn a profit, but concentrating and containing this waste appeared to be an effective and sustainable solution to them. Conversely, of course, for local residents, the solution didn't lie in that domain, or indeed in their domain at all. Whilst not expressing an alternative option for disposing of the waste, and the legislation did not require them to do so, they were clear that the risk to their neighbourhood was unacceptable, and the company were thought to be duplicitous and rapacious, of course. Now, so we have an example here where a company might be regarded as being a villain, but it depends clearly on your perspective. Now, I'd like us to listen to another commentator talking about the role of business in addressing or engaging with environmental problems.
I'm Isabel Carlisle, and I'm Education Coordinator for Transition Network. Transition Network is the charity, it's an NGO, that supports the transition movement worldwide. I think businesses definitely have a leadership role to play in thinking about how we lead our lives, how sustainable our practices are. There are obviously some good examples like carpet companies that lease out carpets and then take them back in again at the end of their life and recycle them, and the work that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is doing about the circular economy is all very inspiring. There isn't enough support, I don't think, at the moment for businesses to think in that circular way, or even to engage communities in what they're doing. So in the transition movement, business is not seen necessarily as an entity to be engaged with and to work with, because it's too intractable. And yet a lot of what we do in transition is thinking about revitalizing our local economy. So definitely connecting to small businesses is something that we do try to do. I think it's greenwash. My perspective on this is that when big businesses are kind of talking about sustainability issues, they are severely hampered in what they can actually do, because we're part of a system that doesn't encourage really radical change towards a degrowth economy. The fact that they're answerable to shareholders, that most people in our society are not aware of many of these issues, or maybe even choose to ignore them if they become more aware, means that it's stakeholder, profit-driven motives, shareholder motives, that are driving all these businesses. And unless we have a major kind of re-education, if you like, of the shareholders, things aren't going to change.
Okay, so there's a fairly trenchant view there about companies verging on villainous, let's say. In her view, it boils down to what cartoonists might call eco-bloodynomics. It's all driven this way because of essentially the capitalist system that we have, that we use to manage our economy. I want to take you into a second example of businesses operating in environmental domains, and perhaps an industrial villain. Let's look at this one. This is an example of an oil company that no longer exists, Gulf Oil, and it had a development in the West Midlands, in West Bromwich actually, in the 1960s. It was a terminal from which they were distributing fuels to local service stations and supermarkets and the like. And you can see here in the picture in the middle the kind of tanks that are used to store oil, and from which road tankers come to collect it, to distribute it. Petrochemicals of different types are stored in different kinds of cylinders, and if we look at the site in 1945, there's a very elderly photograph here, you can see that it's clear. You can see that there's a canal around two sides of the site, and then running through the middle, a very small river, the River Tame, is adjacent to the site. Now, in 1999, the site is again clear. The site is the brown area there, cleared of vegetation, see the same layout of river and canals. The oil terminal has come and gone, a temporary phenomenon. And a temporary phenomenon characteristic of very many industrial developments in what was the heart of the world's industrial revolution. This is the centre of industrial revolution globally. Oil had originally arrived in this terminal by train, and later on transport was switched to an oil pipeline from Milford Haven. It clearly wasn't an attractive facility. Let's go back to the picture. It wasn't an attractive facility. But it's one, again, necessary to maintain the fossil-fueled lifestyles that we all enjoy. So, we see in the top left image the grey area, the conurbation of Birmingham. The green and brown is agricultural land. We see on the right, top right, again the grey and the green areas on the west of the image. Those are the coal measures again. And again, I'm not going to go through all of the imagery, but the water quality in local rivers was very, very poor. Classification of the time was very poor. That was a distinct class water quality very poor. And no real attempt to clean it up in the foreseeable future, because the target for clean-up was also very poor. So what we're saying is nothing can be done, in the opinion of the people of the time, the opinion of the specialists. And the problem was that water seeping out of particularly the western part of the site, and here's a map of the site, water seeping out of the western side of the site, over here, this side, was coming into the River Tame, contaminated with a variety of things, with oil that may or may not have been spilled when the trains were unloading, for example, with ferrous and manganese compounds and a variety of other materials. And every time it rained, seepages, astonishing multicoloured seepages, could be seen along the bank of this river, of water, groundwater coming out into the river. Now, when the water was trapped and exposed to the air, this kind of thing happened. If you look at the 3 jars at the top, when the water was exposed to the air, the series, this is the first one, a few minutes later it looks like this, and then a few minutes later it looks like that. And what is happening is that something in the water is oxidising actually and precipitating out this black iron and manganese compound. So this water is very volatile, very chemically unstable. The company had tried to manage that by trapping some of the groundwater and putting it into a tank and then skimming off the oil and then discharging the water into the river. And that was entirely legal. But they could see that with increasing EU legislation that was not going to be a long-term or a sustainable solution. So I was asked to research more about the hydrological behaviour of the site. And we installed equipment all over the site. We installed rain gauges, monitors on various pumps, monitors on the river and the canal, and water sampling equipment, and we drilled boreholes to see what was going on under the ground. And we had a lot of fun experimenting with the fire hydrant system to put water down the boreholes to see what would happen to it as it went into the ground. And we identified large voids underneath the site. And we started to make findings that were very challenging. We discovered that the oil terminal had been constructed on about 10 metres of industrial refuse, the foundry waste of centuries, plus other unknown dumped materials. And then underneath that there appeared to be a mine shaft. And every time it rained, water immediately ran everywhere on the site, and pulses of contamination were pushed into the oil skimmer, the tank retaining it, in vast quantities. Oil on troubled water, as my heading indicated. Some of this groundwater also seeped directly into the river, which, although itself was contaminated, it became even more so. And occasionally, when sampling water from boreholes, we found up to 1 metre of oil floating on the top of the water. You can see on the image on the right-hand side there a column of oil and water that was removed from under the site. After a few months, well before our hydrological analysis was complete, the company decided to install an additional treatment facility to try and trap and treat this groundwater before releasing it. And they wanted to release it to the normal sewer system, and it wasn't cheap to do this, either to install it or to operate. But the weather overtook events, and that spring that year was very wet, and the water levels began to rise under the site. And the slides here show the pattern. So at the start of our year of monitoring, you can see that the blue lines there, those are, if you like, the contour lines of the water surface, the highest on the right at about 19 metres and falling gently towards the river, water moving from top right to bottom left of the image. But in April, we had a pulse of water coming through from the top edge of the site there at 24, 25 metres above our reference datum and growing. By June it looked like that. So water was now effectively pouring through the site in vast quantities, bringing all sorts of solutes from this contaminated material into the river. And not shown on here though, a saline pulse of water was also coming up into the site, probably from the former mine shaft. They tried to treat this water. The required dosage, if you like, of decontaminants reached absolutely epic proportions, and everything looked black. Now, today I don't have time to examine the whole picture, but the likely explanation of this lies in the historic use of the site, not in the company's operating methods. And if you look very carefully, there's 3 maps here, but the later one, the 1955 one, here's the site, and you can just about see in here, there is an arm of the canal running into the site. What was, if you like, a lay-by for barges discharging industrial waste. And probably the water was coming from there, leaking out of the canal system. Now, what happened then, subsequently, was that the company was taken over. We were required not to publish our findings for fear of interfering with the takeover bid, and that's what we had to do. The company was taken over, we couldn't publish. But I want you to reflect on who's the villain here in this piece, and who might appropriately pay for this kind of solution. The Environment Agency were driven by Europe to tighten their legislation on industrial discharges, and were very clear about what would happen if Gulf Oil did not comply. And the staff at Gulf Oil were not very happy about the situation, at least by the 1990s, because some of them lived locally. Their children would like to have paddled in the river, maybe they would like to have gone fishing in the canal, and they knew that something had got to be done. But the problem was very, very complex. Some people said that the government ought to pay for cleaning it up because the water was coming out of the canal, or a lot of it, and that was owned by British Waterways, or managed by British Waterways, on behalf of the government. And also, the company could only reflect on the fact that them cleaning up their site at a cost of possibly some millions of pounds wouldn't really affect the water quality in the river locally one iota, because of the scale of the problem elsewhere in the catchment. So the site was sold, it was redeveloped as a storage facility, and I'm assuming that now something has been done about the water quality, but it is there. Hopefully a technical remedy has now been found. Now, these kind of problems, the 2 that I've illustrated, can be put into the realms of wicked problems because there are high levels of uncertainty and high levels of or high stakes in the decision making, millions of pounds at stake. So where we have problems that are characterised by low uncertainty and low stakes, we can expect consensus. In this area here, the yellow, we've got sort of middling amounts of both, perhaps like the first example I gave you, where it might be settled by a battle between experts. And then this problem, certainly, as Steve Rayner suggests, is a wicked problem with conflicting world views, people holding completely conflicting world views about who the villains are in this piece and what the role of business is in addressing this kind of problem. I want to play you, let's just skip that one. I want to play you a couple more examples of people talking.
Okay, I'm Martin Griffiths and I'm an independent consultant. I specialise on water and environmental matters. Business has a role because if they run out of water, they can't operate. If they go underwater, they can't operate. So business needs to make sure that the main requirements of the business are secure. Also, business has the capability of bringing innovation in, strategies in, and they can make money out of it if you create the right environment. No, I think one of the problems is that businesses tend to think other people should do it. So they have most of them have quite a short-term agenda. Very few want to invest in environment and water because it's undervalued. So if you actually paid the real cost of water, then you would build in those factors and you would probably end up investing an awful lot more in it. But at the moment it's seen as it should be free, but it's not. I think in terms of business action, it's very variable. Some companies see some benefit in moving forward. A lot of them do see it as greenwash and marketing. Some of them, of course, we're lucky enough in the UK to have some of the very high power national and international engineering companies who, if they have the capability and they build the innovation, then they could make a real difference. But they tend to be quite conservative and want to build more and more of the same, rather than thinking quite radically and doing something completely different.
Okay, so that's one commentator. Here's another one. This is Stuart Haywood-Hyam from Seepage, which is a big waste disposal company. Some of you may know them as people who deal with waste in various places in London, in fact.
Hi, I'm Stuart Overby. I work for CETA, a waste resource and energy company, and I'm their technical development director. I think the leadership requires a strong policy understanding, and it's our job in industry and it's our job as members of the public to inform the policymakers of what we expect of them and what they should generate and listen to in formulating policy. I see very little evidence that policymakers understand what I class as policy, which is multi-generational and long-term social good. And again, I think the only example I can point to at the moment of something that would meet that definition is the carbon law. I think waste, I think energy don't have that vision, don't have that longevity, and don't have that purpose, and therefore don't drive that level of thinking and cooperation. I'm naturally an optimist, but I think the whole industry sees the opportunity in the circular economy and can see a great way of delivering a new business with new opportunities. So yes, I am very optimistic.
If we think about the commentators we've heard so far, most of them are slightly sceptical about the role of business in actually addressing environmental challenges. If you wanted to put a list of potential roles for business, I think we could have them as innovators, potentially proactively addressing things. We could have them as leaders of change. We could have them as drivers of government policy, as motivators of community. Or we could have them as passive recipients of external pressures from legislation or policy. Or we could have them as actually as villains, concerned only about issues relating to their stakeholders. Now, I want you to listen to one or two more people, and I want you to see if you can hear
I'm Faith
differences
Coleshaw.
in what
I
they
work
say.
in one of the research councils, the Natural Environment Research Council, but I run a partnership on water which brings together industry with the research community. Okay, so I think businesses have a strong role to do what they can in terms of protecting the environment and lessening their impact on it. And I think actually there's something in it for them, in the sense that money makes the world go round. There are advantages to them doing this, not just financial, and I think that you can often make the case that there are financial advantages, but also in terms of PR and in terms of how they're looked at by the rest of the world.
So we're starting to hear somebody with a much more positive view. Here's another one. This is Nigel Matravers.
My name is Nigel Matravers.
Based in the city.
I'm a civil engineer and waste manager. I am the chairman of the Waste and Resources panel at the Institution of Civil Engineers and also a liveryman of the Water Conservators. Public opinion with regard to waste is often underestimated. Waste management is actually almost where people meet local government. They may not use their library, they may never go to town hall, but they put their waste out every week. And therefore people actually are quite concerned now about, are they doing the best thing with their waste? They will talk about, well, why has he got a green bin and I've got a brown bin? Surely I should be doing this. Why can't I do this with my waste? I'm looking to do that. So public opinion has changed very quickly, quite significantly. Some politicians haven't caught up with that, but I do believe that the public, for the most part, are actually very concerned about their waste, and they understand issues of resources and are looking to do more, but often are frustrated, they feel, by the systems that they are given by their councils. I believe that government is being led by industry in many ways. The government is reluctant to invest or do more than it has to in order to meet any EU targets. Whereas industry is actually looking to recover more materials to get better value from that, and local government is. So, well, we can actually recover value from this, and we can help make money, which is going to reduce our council tax. So there is a frustration that the government is not encouraging as much innovation or providing support that in fact the industry and indeed the public actually want.
So my name is Richard Miller. I'm Head of Sustainability at Innovate UK, which is the UK's innovation agency, and I help businesses to be more successful through innovation. Businesses have a lot of responsibility with respect to environmental challenges. Businesses need healthy populations, they need a healthy environment in which to work. Many of them depend on what are called the things that the environment gives us, the air, the water, the soil. Industry critically depends on those things, and if it damages them, it doesn't have a future. So a lot of what business needs to think about is how do we avoid doing damage to our own future by damaging the resources, the natural resources that we need. And the second thing is what market opportunities are offered to us by providing better solutions or clearing up environmental problems.
Just give you one more. This one is Paul de Silva, who is the head of nature at Friends of the Earth, who you will remember was one of the groups who supported the local residents in my first example. And he just listen to carefully what he says about.
So I'm Paul de Silva.
Business.
I'm head of nature at Friends of the Earth. And that includes running our Bee Cause campaign, which has persuaded the government to introduce a national pollinator strategy to reverse bee decline. In the 21st century, the role of business is changing. I think a lot of businesses I have dealings with are thinking on longer time spans than government tends to. It's not that government doesn't think about those timescales, but it doesn't come through. Increasingly, I deal with businesses who are thinking about their supply chains and where their business will be in 20 or 30 years, and I don't see a lot of that action from government. I would like to see more businesses doing that, because they are going to be the ones that will have to lead and innovate and may even have to change their businesses totally.
So those are some strange bedfellows in that set. Regardless of their backgrounds, they're all suggesting, last few, that businesses are playing a very strong hand in addressing environmental challenges, and in some cases that they are leading government by example. Now, when they talk about leading businesses, the ones that are normally cited, there are many that are normally cited, I've got 3 of them up here. Marks and Spencer's have this plan A because there is no plan B. Unilever doing a lot of work on removing carbon emissions and reducing resource consumption from products like shampoo and detergent. And the third one over there, Janico, is an offshoot of Wessex Water, who had an award-winning scheme to capture biogas from sewage at the treatment plant. So what you see there is a poo-powered car, basically, which caused a great deal of amusement with local children in Bristol. And is now actually, was the forerunner of research that means that the gas from sewage is now being used to power the treatment plant, which is a very clever use of technology. Now, we need to ask ourselves if this is just greenwash, or if these businesses and other similar ones are actually doing the right thing. After all, Marks and Spencer still wants us to buy more clothes. Most of the energy consumption from Unilever products is not actually in their manufacture and distribution, but is in the way we use them when we shower or wash our clothes. And Janico's work is still very small in scale, and they still pump hundreds of cubic metres of effluent around the region while closing local sewage treatment plants. So there are pros and cons, and it depends, of course, on your worldview and whether you think this is just hype. Now, hype's an interesting thing. Greenwash is an interesting thing. I just pulled this one out of a catalogue that fell through my door the other day. It's a wonderful example of greenwash. It talks about making logs for your fire out of recycled newspapers, and it says carbon neutral free heat. Well, clearly it can't be. It's burning newspapers. There's no way in which it's carbon neutral free. It's a piece of greenwash, and there was plenty more of that in the example. Now, I got 2 quotes two more quotes to play you.
I'm Julie Hill. I'm an independent environmental commentator. I have a number of roles, including with Green Alliance and with the Waste and Resources Action Programme. The role of business is to innovate. There are huge markets implied in the fact that global populations are growing and growing in affluence, and that means ever greater resource take. And if we can't find clever ways to be efficient in our use of resources, to recover resources, to have a more circular economy, we won't cope with the consequences of that resource take. Businesses who either have a self-interest in more efficient use of resources because of dealing with rising costs or volatility or temporary scarcity in their key resources do address these problems. I think those that haven't yet faced those kinds of issues are slow to recognise that there will be some sort of resource crunch for them coming down the line. I think the idea of greenwash for businesses is a bit unfair. I think businesses need to get reputational advantage from their environmental initiatives quite a lot of the time because they may not see immediate cost advantage. As far as I can see, a lot of enlightened businesses realise that improving their environmental footprint is a long-run investment, and the way they get that past the short-termist thinking in their organisations is to position it as brand advantage, and I think that's fine.
Lord Smith of Finsbury.
So you want to know that I'm Chris Smith, Lord Smith of Finsbury, and I was until about 2 months ago the chairman of the Environment Agency. Now I'm still the chairman of the Advertising Standards Authority. I'm chairing a task force on shale gas, and I remain passionately interested and concerned about the environment. Businesses have a very key role in addressing the environmental challenge. And in quite a number of ways, the world of business is ahead of government and the politicians in this. If you look, for example, at the way in which most of the major retailers are now thinking about their transport movements, about their energy use, about what happens to their waste, about making sure that their stores are resilient. They've been thinking about this far more seriously than most governments around the world have. It's what governments ought to be doing, but the world of business is ahead of them. It is absolutely not all greenwash. There are some companies who engage in greenwash. I know from my work at the Advertising Standards Authority that there are some claims that are made by companies about their environmental credentials which actually don't stand up to terribly careful scrutiny. But nonetheless, there are rather a lot of businesses that are genuinely taking this seriously.
Okay, now as we've progressed through my talk, I've introduced you to people that I would say have three different perspectives, three different worldviews. And this issue has been addressed by American researcher called Nancy Roberts, no relation, unfortunately, a Californian lady, and she classifies different kinds of worldviews into three categories. She talks about hierarchical views, people who have a top-down, rational, analytical approach, scientific approach, we might say, to solving problems. Those who have a broadly what we might call a competitive approach, that businesses have the solutions, they're ahead of government, let's say, and that their expertise will drive innovation. It will develop new innovative products and services which will address these environmental challenges effectively. And the third view she calls egalitarian, which is a view that's really associated with a perspective that says problems need to be opened up to all the stakeholders through consultations, through organisations like civic organisations, citizen juries and local advisory groups and so on, whether or not those people have any particular expertise, but that all views are valid. Now, those three those three things, those three worldviews, I think, have been represented in some of the people we've heard speaking. And picking up an approach to this from Steve Rayner from Oxford University, he puts these three groups into a triangle. And he talks about the three different groups and the ways in which these interact. He talks about the work of different organisations, and I put this one on because this is the organisation that actually pays me. This is a government agency. This is an organisation that brokers dialogue between scientists or researchers and business to try and get new technologies developed. There is work going on which we might classify as science outreach. It's done by the research councils, and it's really associated with scientists talking to the general public. There are a lot of studies going on about how that can be done in terms of language. So we're talking here about the left-hand side of this diagram, interactions between stakeholders, multiple stakeholders, and scientists. I have to say it happens usually to be top-down. There's a lot less evidence of listening to the reverse flow. And then if we look at the bottom here, interactions between businesses and the general public, we all know that when Marks and Spencers talk about Plan A, it's our Marks and Spencers suddenly, and they're asking us to comment through social media, for example, on what we think about their various policies. Now, in fact, the only way in which, in Nancy Roberts' approach, and indeed mine, the only way in which we're actually going to get some solutions to these problems is to see if we can actually reconcile these three views and occupy the middle ground in this triangle. It's not going to be enough to have these bipartite discussions. And there are going to be great difficulties in assuming that people can talk appropriately, but there are going to be greater difficulties in trying to reconcile what are three very different world views about the way progress has to be made and who ought to be in expressing an opinion. Now, in my last talk, I did pick up the use of social media in doing this, and I'm going to be pursuing that further in my next talk, which is really looking about the role of educational organisations in furthering environmental agendas. So I'd very well, in the spirit of that, I'd very much welcome your own commentary. And when you collect if you collect a transcript of the lecture on the way out, that you'll see the hashtag on there. My next talk is on the 15th of January. But please do engage in the dialogue about how we might actually address environmental problems more effectively. Thank you.